Welcome, folks. It's great to have you all here for this afternoon's conversation about regranting. We've got a really exciting group of folks who are going to be diving into this topic with us, names that may be old and new to folks in the room. So just for a bit of context, as the Institute's really gotten to know all of your organizations across the Place Matters footprint, and we thought about which questions are most salient for the cohort, we've heard time and time again that regranting is something that may be new to folks, or it's a muscle that is sort of being developed. It's obviously something that can be political, so they're both kind of mechanics and relationship pieces. So given that this core component of the work is both art and science for backbone organizations, we wanted to bring together a cross-section of folks who could really speak to what it takes to pull this off effectively, sort of troubleshoot with you all in real time challenges or opportunities you may be experiencing, and really share what they've learned at this time. And we know that over the past year and a half plus in this environment we're in, there have been some really innovative ways that folks across the country have thought about regranting, and we know it'll continue to be important for place-based work around the country. So I'm really excited to have the group that we have here today. As the conversation continues, we'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free to chime in with, make sure you direct that toward everyone so we can see, and we will make sure to hold time for sort of verbal Q&A toward the end. So with that, I'm going to introduce our illustrious panel, and we'll get right into it. So I'll start off with Josh Kirschenbaum, the Chief Operating Officer of PolicyLink. Josh is an old friend of HCZ and someone I consider a confidant and partner in this work, so it's great to have you, Josh. Josh is one of the original PolicyLink team members and has worked across the programmatic, comms, and operations team, which allows him to bring comprehensive organizational knowledge to bear on supporting diverse alliances to advance equity. I'll say he also brings comprehensive organizational knowledge about this field, which is why I blow him up regularly for his perspectives on this work. So thank you for continuing to be such a valuable felt partner to us all, Josh.
It's a joy.
All right, next is Erica Bleicher, the Fiscal Sponsorship Manager of PolicyLink. So Erica works closely with a PolicyLink fiscally sponsored project to support and help build their capacity to advance racial and economic equity. With ongoing partnership, these collaborations enable PolicyLink to expand opportunities to issue area experts that mobilize resources to their communities. So we've got a 1-2 punch here from PolicyLink. I think there are different perspectives we'll have, and looking forward to hearing you all tag team. Third, we've got Alan Kwabena-Frimpong, co-founder of Liberation Ventures. Alan is a cultural strategist, artist, cooperative entrepreneur, and resource mobilizer who organizes through social movements for solidarity and philanthropy. And of note, Liberation Ventures is currently being incubated at PolicyLink. So really excited about the work you're doing. Alan, we got to reconnect through this work, so it's good to have you with us, brother, and I'm looking forward to hearing your voice. Last, some might argue not least, I wouldn't personally, of course, but you got man who needs no introduction around here, my boss, Kwame Owusu-Kesse, CEO of the Harlem Children's Zone. So as our CEO, he spearheaded our national COVID response efforts, raising more than $50 million to support 7 cities across the US. And given the work we've done on our national COVID response and the strategy that accompanied it, we thought his voice would be really helpful in this conversation as we think about the future of regranting work. So great to have this all-star cast with us, and excited to hear from you all about your experiences. So a few things I want to sort of lay out. As I mentioned, we've heard from a number of folks across the screen that regranting is a challenge that backbone leaders continue to think about both on the sort of national, regional, and neighborhood levels. And when we got together recently, team, to discuss some of the themes, a few things stood out to me, and I'm hoping we can cover them in detail. One is the idea that this is really a powerful mechanism for unlocking capital for organizations led by people of color. So we have a lot of examples of folks in this room of people who are advancing this work for Black and brown folks who may not have always been at the table when it came to these big grants. And we think regranting is a way to shift that paradigm. The second piece, and I know we've got some folks in the room who are not currently highlighted on the screen with deep expertise here, and that's on the mechanics of regranting. So I want to get a little bit into the nuts and bolts so folks understand what we're really talking about. And then the last piece is around the relationship. So what does it mean to really balance those standards of accountability with accessibility, knowing that, again, given the range of folks we want to serve, not everyone has traditionally been invited to these conversations. Not everyone has the capacity today to necessarily meet the standards that are required. But how do we enter a sort of constructive conversation so that folks are on the pathway to sort of meeting their end of the arrangement here? So those are some of the themes that we've heard folks really want to talk about. I think there are a unique set of perspectives here that will cover all of that and more for us. So for starters, would love to just go around and hear a little bit about your entry points in the regranting process. At what phase did this become particularly relevant for your organization, and what's your overall experience been so far? So let's start with the PolicyLink folks. Maybe Josh, if you can lead us off.
Oh, thank you, Hailing, Kwame. Great to see you, and Jeff. Also, just want to thank the Harlem Children's Zone for having us. Feels like family day for us, and your extended network here. Just so appreciate it, and also just really thrilled to see the William Julius Wilson Institute. And I say all those words because Professor Wilson is really essential to this work, and I think it's important to honor one of our founding board members. And really thinking about this work, because this work is all about intention. You're really thinking about why regranting, and this is essential to PolicyLink. For those of you that don't know PolicyLink, PolicyLink is a national policy and advocacy organization devoted to advancing racial and economic equity by lifting up the voice, wisdom, and experience of local leaders. And hearing that mission, I don't say it just to sort of put our mission on the table, but it really is. Regranting is essential to everything we do at PolicyLink. Right now, and Erica and Alan will talk a little bit more about it, but almost 25% of our budget is moving to local partners. And this is a budget now, $17, $20 million a year. So we're talking substantial amounts of resources to be able to do the work of advancing racial equity. And thinking about that, I also have to honor, besides honoring Professor Wilson, is honoring, the relationship that PolicyLink had to have. Imagine Angela Glover Blackwell, a esteemed leader in the field, coming into this work with a vision for PolicyLink. How do you craft policy based on local innovation and wisdom? And we ourselves had to be incubated at the Urban Institute. We could not come out as a Black-led organization with the resources that we were looking to sort of move and create a multi-million-dollar national policy organization without these types of relationships and partnerships. And I think we've come a long way. It's been 23 years ago to this month that we were founded, than when you had to have a white-led institution incubating a Black-led policy organization. And I just want you all to hold that as we think about this conversation today. In addition to that, data from Bridgespan and Echoing Green, and this is data on nonprofits, not all nonprofits. These are Echoing Green's Black Male Achievement Fellowship nonprofits, where the Black-led organizations were 45% smaller than their white counterparts. And this is doing Black male achievement work. In addition to that, 91% smaller in terms of unrestricted net assets. And so now we're talking about racial equity has been centered for the nation. Designing a nation that works for all is all about getting racial equity right. And how do we do it in a way that really begins to think about grant making as an essential function? There's four really important points and barriers that I think we're going to talk about today as well, that Bridgespan and PolicyLink, that Bridgespan brought to us and PolicyLink really agrees with. And it's essential in these regranting relationships to get Black-led and organizations of color connected to resources. There's a relationship building that is essential to this work. And then not only there's relationships, but how do you begin that rapport and trust that this is how the work has to happen, has to be centered at the local level, those most proximate to the work. And you all know this on this call so well. And then you got to land the support. It's a big deal and a big leap between just building a relationship, building trust, but also the significant amounts of dollars that have to be in place to do this work. And finally, it doesn't just come with the first grant or the regrant. How do we sustain this? How do we grow this? How do we bake this in, institutionalize what regranting starts us to do in terms of moving power? And PolicyLink, if you sort of, as we talk about this today, you're going to see only works in partnership. Angela taught us this early on. If you can do it alone, it's either the idea is too small or it's not a good idea. And really, we think about how our partnerships are essential to us. And before I turn to Erica and Alan, just to open up with any other remarks, is that I want to hold on to 5 different types of ways that we think about regranting at PolicyLink. And these are all essential. And I think there's a spectrum of them. So the first is working advisory groups. Anyone we work with doing this work, we pay them at PolicyLink through regrants. And we think about our Winning on Equity working group. When we're thinking about Michael McAfee's vision for actually how do we design a nation that works for all, we're partnered with dozens of grassroots organizations across the country, and we use regranting to resource those folks for their time, wisdom, and experience in this work. In addition to that, the second area is grassroots caucuses. We do a lot of work around building caucuses across the country where we see the work much bigger than anything that PolicyLink could do. And we think about this, we have the Water Equity and Climate Resiliency Caucus that has literally 75 members, and half of the budget of that caucus is dispersed through regrants to those members. And all these groups are on the ground grassroots organizations. Third, really important, while this work is important to get the work of PolicyLink done and move policy, that we have action communities where we're actually working with folks on the ground to move policy. We have a network of about a dozen folks, cities and counties for fines and fees justice, where we're moving about $25,000 to $50,000 a year to these organizations to actually diminish the fines and fees that are levied on Black and Brown communities. Fourth is real partnerships. We're building a partnership around the housing justice narrative with Race Forward and Community Change. So we look for regranting also to peer organizations in addition to grassroots groups. And that work has raised about $10 million. And of that, it gets dispersed to those other two organizations. And then about $2 million is used for regranting. So these partnerships are really essential. And then finally, alliances. How do we actually federate and build alliances to do this work? And we have a new alliance around corporate racial equity, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But really, how do we begin to get the private sector, corporations, advancing racial equity? And we have a new initiative that we've partnered with FSG, a consulting firm, and Just Capital, really looking at the future of capitalism. I'll talk more about some of these different types of relationships that this grassroots regranting has brought us to. But what's really essential, before I turn to Erica and Alan for any opening comments, that there are these 5 different types of regranting: advisory groups, grassroots caucuses, action communities, partnerships, and alliances. Hailing, I'm gonna just see if Erica or Alan want to open up with anything to add to that.
I've got nothing to add, Josh. That was great.
Great. Alan?
Yeah, I feel like the relationships piece is really key. And just for folks, Alan Quabada from Pong, he, him, his. I'm from Jersey, but just moved to Inglewood, California. So it's just good to be on the call and thankful for the invitation. And I'm a co-founder of Liberation Ventures. And Liberation Ventures, as incubated by PolicyLink, is a organization, a field building organization that is fueling the movement for racial repair in America by winning on reparations and coming up with multiple supports and building the momentum towards a comprehensive federal program on reparations. And so I'm sure as folks have either followed in the news or through your conversations know that the work around reparations is really central in the racial justice work. And so for the piece that Joss is talking about, as a field building organization that is fairly new, that is working with legacy organizations that have been working 30 and 40 years to get us to where on the House floor, the House of Representatives Bill 40, HR 40 on reparations is now coming to light for a vote. It's really crucial for us to think about the relationships that we can cultivate with organizations that have been doing the work for a really long time and captivating the momentum of the moment post George Floyd with newer organizations that have come to bear, and seeing how we transform our relationships with money and with grants being as a unit that we can use to be able to foster those relationships, to fortify and strengthen and be very clear about our goal as to why we would be regranting to organizations in our field building work. And so I think typically we think about grant making outside of building unity and alliances, as Josh mentioned, but in this age of decolonizing wealth and philanthropy, I think there are real opportunities that we've been seeing in the past decade that allow us to get to the point of where we can reassess our practices around grant making and do so in a way that is much more relational. So that's the work that we've been embarking on, and we'll talk more about it, but we've now gone through our first round of grants within the ecosystem, and we've started to learn even a lot just from the past 8 months that we've been able to engage on the endeavor. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. And one of the reasons why I'm really excited you're here is because you sort of wear two hats, both as a beneficiary and sort of a provider of this re-granting kind of work. And I'm not sure where exactly you'd fit into Josh's taxonomy. I think I'd fail that quiz, but once I get my notes up, I could probably place you on that spectrum somewhere too. So really helpful to have that tool. So Kwame, you're coming in from a different perspective. Obviously, HCZ has been doing a lot of new big things, and among them was this idea of re-granting in response to the COVID work. So we'd love for you to share just some overview before we go deeper on how we got into that work and what you think we learned.
I think for a point of clarity, right, HCZ is not in the normal business of re-granting, nor is it a continued desire of ours, but how we got into it was born out of necessity, right? It was a way of being able to effectively scale impact in a moment of crisis. March 2020, COVID hit us. And as we were the epicenter of the pandemic at the time, we knew that this was going to devastate our community. And as Jeff and I started to see what was happening all across the country, we knew we couldn't think about just Central Harlem, that there would be other communities that looked like ours that would be feeling the same level of devastation that we were feeling here on the ground in Harlem. We were presented with unique fundraising opportunities where we could have made a choice of just focusing on Central Harlem, but core to who we are as an organization and the mission, particularly in this moment of crisis, we felt that there was a unique opportunity to leverage the access that we have and the unique fundraising opportunity through the audacious platform that is housed at TED to be able to engage in a meaningful partnership with 6 additional cities across America. So that was Oakland, Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, and Newark. In addition to working in close partnership with their partners, PolicyLink, Strive Together, and the NAACP. So what was born out of necessity actually turned into a very enlightening and enriching experience that we learned about the importance of re-granting. We learned about building strong relationships, having a level of transparency, accountability, and in many ways, felt that this could serve, the lessons that we learned through that unique experience could serve as a model to continue to be replicated and inform philanthropy in a unique way. So more to come on that, but that's how we got into the business of re-granting.
That's great. Thanks, Kwame. And I know that something we just referenced, this idea of partnership and building infrastructure and community, especially for Black-led organizations, is really important for us. I know it's important for our partners at Blue Meridian and the general Place Matters cohort. And I think much of that comes down to how you do this work. I think we understand why we're in this business at this phase, or at least had been for a period at HCZ. But I think the question is, if we're looking to shift power, how we do so in a way that's sustainable and makes a meaningful impact on the organizations and the communities we want to serve. So given the audience, we have backbone leaders from around the country who have a really unique leverage point in this work. I'm interested in what perspectives you all would share around what it means to center the shift of power and any advice you'd have on how folks can do that intentionally.
I'm happy to jump in. Whenever there's a discussion about money, it is necessary to have a discussion about power. Right? And the responsibility of having to re-grant is a form of power in itself. So recognizing that, I think, is an important first step of establish any baseline level of trust within a relationship. And I think for us, we were very nervous about that, if I can be candid, right? We're amongst friends, so this is to be a candid conversation, because we are afraid about what the power dynamics of money would do to the relationships that we were building with our co-practitioners in the field of comprehensive place-based work. And so early on, I was very transparent, one, about the concern I had, and two, about laying out what the rules of engagement were as it relates to the centralized funding mechanism that we were connected to, and what we would be asking of our partners. And what we led with was, we trust you. The point of this is not for us to micromanage every single move that you make, not to have you inundated with all types of paperwork. My job is to provide cover. There are going to be certain things that we do need to report on. Here's what I know them to be. Here's the timelines in which those are going to occur. Other than that, we are going to be out of your hair unless you need additional support from us in ABC ways, which we'd be more than happy to share best practices of what we're experiencing on the ground, serve as a connective tool to the other practitioners a part of this coalition. But again, being transparent about the sensitivity we have around the power dynamics and how this is a relationship that's being built on our trust in you to be able to execute on an outcome. The thing that I do want to emphasize is that it is insufficient to view regranting as a tool of building relationships. I think you fall into trick box, particularly if you're regranting to multiple organizations that you say, okay, I have a lot of organizations. I don't want to make anybody mad. So I'm just going to split this pot of money equally because then no one's mad at me and we can build relationships. But the reason why you were granted a set of dollars is that you are working towards a common goal. So there has to be clarity on what is it that you all are working collectively to accomplish. What are the roles in which that we play individually in attaining that collective goal? What are the accountability mechanisms that we will have in place to hold each other honest, to deliver with excellence on what we said that we're going to execute on? And what are the opportunities that we will create for transparent communication in order to course correct, because challenges will come up along the way. But I think establishing those rules of engagement up front, being anchored on having a common North Star that we're working towards, with the positive externality of strengthening relationships and fostering new relationships and connections, I think was a really important way of approaching the work of regrant.
Very helpful. Embedded in this perspective I'm hearing from Kwame is this idea of accountability. So we're in relationship with each other on either ends of this kind of transaction. Hopefully this is also transformational work, but fundamentally regranting is a transaction. Alan, you wear, again, a couple of hats here and you're on both sides of that accountability dynamic. So I'm curious how you've experienced that and what perspective you have as someone who's holding this unique dual role.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Kwame, my brother Kwame mentioned, I'm Kwame, that we're, got the Ghana connection here, but they're really cool.
I was going to call it out. I'm glad you got there before me. I was talking out of school. It had to be said.
It had to be said. You see the days, it's like, okay, we're in the building, so it's good. It's good, and our people have a legacy of really understanding what it means to steward resources. If I think about the Akana Shanti people and all the different tribal ethnic groups back home in Ghana and the legacy that it brings to this work around reparations, and thinking about the context setting here in the United States. So if we're talking about what does it mean to heal from the legacy of slavery and settler colonialism, and we're engaged in a political project where we ourselves within PolicyLink, within this nonprofit sector, are dealing with the real harms and the legacies of the ways that we're thinking about how wealth has been extracted. And now we're saying we want to redistribute that wealth and be in a practice of redistributing that wealth in a way that strengthens our relationships so that we can achieve this goal of not only winning on reparations, but creating scenarios and conditions where culturally, politically, and economically, the lived conditions for Black people in the United States, and then by proxy, all of us get to change in how we govern, how we make decisions together, how we co-create the lives that we deserve. And it allows for us to just interrogate our relationships in the context then of the regranting process. And I think Kwame said it best, that even for us, we engaged in a almost 7-month journey of just being able to understand and build relationships. And, as an organizer, having the one-to-one relationships with folks in the ecosystem and having the upfront conversations about the power dynamics at play with funders. And so having that understanding of the expectations from the grantor to the grantee, understanding the operational and programmatic growth expectations, redefining what success looks like outside of social returns on investment. All of these things get to be interrogated if we're on a political project and having a very clear aim about what it means to win on reparations, and organizing groups of people who have been involved in the work, both seasoned and new, to engage in that process honestly, and for us to have honest relationships about how we then are going to be relating to folks who are going to be giving us money and entrusting in us to be able to then redistribute that in a way that holds that same amount of integrity for the folks who have been doing this work. And I think for us as an intermediary, we also have to ask ourselves, how do we get these resources in places where grant making institutions cannot, because of the policies, processes, and other dynamics of decision making that are in the sector. So we're constantly asking ourselves, who are we accountable to? In what ways are we building governance processes around that through the learning community that we're establishing that also is giving out grants? And how through that programming do these grantees come together as our partners as we learn together around how to navigate this system, so that we look at our theory of change, our activities, and see where we can collaborate, so that we are not reinforcing a marketplace of competition, but rather a marketplace where we can restore the commons and see what our roles and functions are, as Kwame mentioned. So those are the opportunities that we're seeing through engaging in a process of repair in this learning community that we're developing at Liberation Ventures with the support of PolicyLink, to say, money is one thing, to be able to get a learning grant, just to be able to learn of what's happening in the ecosystem when many organizations don't yet know each other. So there is a benefit on that end. The other end, though, is to be able to empower grantees to see the opportunity of what it means to collaborate and make decisions together, which is one of our other ultimate goals, to ensure that they are then engaged in how decisions get made to where money goes in the ecosystem, because they know best, given their lived experience as in their own expertise. And it shifts the dynamics that we see in the sector in traditional philanthropy around whose expertise we lend on to be able to define what our metrics of success are, rather than looking at the conditions for satisfaction that are being led by those grassroots organizations doing the work. But yeah, I'll stop there. But I feel like those are the two dynamics that we look at: the grantor to the grantee relationships and the expectations and the power dynamics there, and also the grantor to intermediary relationships are really key. And I see that as being an intermediate and short-term solution. For me, grant making is part of that short-term solution to address some of the structural issues.
Powerful. Thank you, Alan. There's so much to unpack there, but I think fundamentally what I'm hearing is this does call for, in some ways, a radical or at least fundamental reimagining of the relationships we're in this work, from those who provide us with capital, those who are deploying it in different ends of the spectrum. So really helpful to consider as we turn back to PolicyLink. So Erica, when you think about fiscal sponsorship, you all play an important role in the dynamic that we just heard Alan describe. And I'm wondering how you all think about accountability, and even if you have any examples of actors you've worked with out there who have pushed you all to think differently about relationships and how you kind of provide resources in this way.
Sure. And yeah, I will talk about kind of two different hats that I wear at PolicyLink. And one, I am managing all of our grant making, and then separately also managing our fiscally sponsored projects. So building off of what Alan was describing in grant making, with traditional best practices really being rooted in foundations, trying to preserve their reputation and do things, you know, the way that they wanted, with the power that they held. And the more into it I get in grant making, the more I understand that what the IRS cares about is that grantors understand or are able to show that their grant funds were spent responsibly. But really what the measurement is there are no specific rules. So all of the due diligence materials that if you were getting started in grant making and you were like, what should I do? What is the most, professional foundation? What do they do for their grant making? You really would be following steps that are created not based on actual rules and regulations. And so I think that's an important piece to think about it, and why folks like Alan's work and Kwame's outlook of what grant making can be is this is a real opportunity to re-envision what grant making can be like, remove that power dynamic and build in partnership. And on the grant making side, the way that we're aligning those values with our operations is one, giving unrestricted funding whenever possible. Two, simplifying the application process. And so this does require effort on the front end, and Alan can definitely speak more on the Liberation Ventures side of, there's a lot of conversation with partners before you even get into, the formal application process. But once someone, a grantee, is actually invited to apply, making it as easy as possible for them, rather than having them jump through hoops to prove themselves to you. Being transparent and responsive to grantees, Kwame already mentioned this, but that piece is so important if you're going to actually show partnership with grantees. And then optional or minimal reporting requirements, I think, is an additional important piece. And there's lots of innovation here, accepting grant reports that are submitted to other funders, so grantees don't have to duplicate efforts. There are some innovative options for reporting that PolicyLink has tried out, like podcasts, enabling grantees to report back via a podcast, so they actually have something at the end that they can share in other places. And so I would just advise that, the next really incredible and useful reporting tool might come from someone on this call. And I would say, don't, just because grant making has been structured away for however many years, started by foundations, as we're talking about granting to our partners, it's going to take all of us to re-envision what best practice looks like, and really building on each other's expertise here.
That's great. Thank you.
And I'll really quick just go into fiscal sponsorship now, or should we?
Yes, yeah. No, absolutely. So part of what I think I'm hoping we can hear from the PolicyLink side is this work requires a lot of technical expertise and infrastructure, but also it's adaptive, right? So I think we've heard a little bit about the relational pieces, the way we need to grow as organizations and as partners in this work, but we'd be remiss if we didn't actually cover the nuts and bolts. So I think we have a sense of your mindset. I'm also curious about how you've unlocked these opportunities just through different practices and systems. So it sounds like that may be where you're headed, Erica.
Yes, exactly. And real quick, before jumping over to fiscal sponsorship, a couple of critical systems that I recommend everyone familiarize yourself with before setting up your grant making program is get to know the difference between general support and project support grants. Understand if you're funding lobbying, really take the time to understand the parameters, and go even farther and advise your grantees on those parameters too. It's confusing, but it is one of the areas where for compliance, these are the pieces that matter much more than whether you have 10 due diligence materials at the forefront. It really is making sure that your grant making is compliant with lobbying rules. And again, that general support and project support grant piece does get important. And then determine that process for you, document it. And from what I hear from our council is, if you can say, this is what our grant making looks like, and be able to have repetition in that, that is really what the IRS is looking for in terms of consistency and making sure that you're following through with what that plan is, not necessarily the specifics, and making sure you're aligned with exactly what they have outlined, because they really don't have those parameters in place. So then moving to fiscal sponsorship. So fiscal sponsorship is when a C3 organization extends its tax exempt status to support and help build the capacity of other projects. So some of you may be fiscally sponsored projects, you may have heard of fiscal sponsors, you may grant to any and all of the above. And so PolicyLink, as a C3, we have a handful of fiscally sponsored projects, and Liberation Ventures is a perfect example. So we support Liberation Ventures with compliance, financial management, contracts, donor management. We handle the HR, and really the purpose of fiscal sponsorship is efficiency to build infrastructure. It's a way to provide back office support that many smaller organizations don't have the capacity to take on, and helps these organizations build those systems over time. And what I love about it is that it allows the keepers of the mission to have more time to do their vital work without having to focus on those back-end administrative pieces that are so burdensome to these smaller projects. And for in the context of grant making, I think that fiscal sponsorship is the ultimate example of partnership. So with Liberation Ventures, they are part of PolicyLink. We are under the same C3 status, but we are also supporting them in so many other ways than just granting them funds. And that's that capacity building piece. And so I think that I know that fiscal sponsorship is that partnership with smaller, in particular, people of color-led organizations. It's the entry for many of these organizations and the foundation for them to scale their impact. So my advice is, one, fund fiscally sponsored projects, because it both supports the project you're trying to fund and the sponsor that is funding not only that project, but other like-minded and values-aligned projects. Also support fiscal sponsors with funding directly. They are enabling lots of smaller projects to build their mission in a way that is often overlooked, and a lot of funders see, just want to go straight to the programming. They don't want to invest in capacity building and infrastructure building, and fiscal sponsorship is a really important way to level that playing field, particularly for people of color run organizations. Another thing to consider is whether or not your organization could fiscally sponsor a project. If you have a project or partners that are wanting to do work but don't have the capacity to create their own organization, and it's really aligned with the work that you're doing, fiscal sponsorship is a great way to bring those folks into your organization, but let them have the independence to run their own programming. So traditionally, foundations have not been sure about what fiscal sponsorship is and been hesitant. That tide is changing a little bit. But I think particularly for small grassroots organizations, fiscal sponsorship opens up a lot of doors. And so investing in fiscally sponsored projects and fiscal sponsors and considering doing this yourself is a way to open the field up and open up funding opportunities to projects doing some of the most innovative work on the ground.
Thank you. So another question that comes up quite a bit is around the politics of regranting, and that is, it sometimes is zero sum in that you have finite amount of dollars you can get out the door with a number of partners. So curious, Josh, if you have any experience thinking about how to avoid optics around sort of winners and losers, and how you really make sure that folks get the resourcing they need, understanding that you've got sort of a broader basket of priorities you're accountable to.
Thanks, Hailing. I think that's one of the hardest questions that any of us will address. And you're always going to have hard decisions to make. And when we make these decisions at PolicyLink, we really try to make them in partnership with our partners on the ground. The reason I brought up those 5 categories in the beginning is you really think about some of the caucuses that we're putting ourselves in the middle of, where we are now relinquishing the power of running the show. And I think that's really important, is that we actually get into, Alan said it, we are moving in the equity movement from a state of competition to one of collaboration, and hopefully one of transformative solidarity. So when we're working in our caucuses, we are actually one member of a caucus making decisions about regranting and how dollars should flow. And taking away that power, and Kwame, I really appreciate what you said about the connection to power and money. And it's power, money, and I would just add relationships. It's a triangle. You have to hold all 3 of those together, because it doesn't matter even how much money PolicyLink might be moving or a foundation might be moving. There's intrinsic power in the organizations that are most proximate doing the work. And how does that power actually fit into the equation when we think about making these hard decisions? So when at PolicyLink, you'll hear from maybe Erica Moore and myself, there are 3 guiding principles we use, and these really to hold on to this. Is the first, as we've all touched on it, is relationships matter. You have to come into this regranting work in relationship and in tight relationship. And that's just not who is my pal, who can I work with, but deeply, how do you actually be in relationship in strategic sense, in an emotional sense, And really, that's why we took on fiscal sponsorships at PolicyLink. Erica is new. She sounds like she's been around PolicyLink since day one, but Erica's brand new. We realized as 20 years into it, we had to bring on this capacity in this tool. And I'm just going to shout out to Mike Asid, our CFO, who brought this to us at PolicyLink. This is new, but we could not be in the work that we're doing to advance equity or social change by just regranting. We had to take that next step. It's not the only step, but it's an essential one. So relationships, you got to know who to trust to get started. Number two is that community voice matters. It really runs the show for us about those relationships you can trust, but also how do you stretch? How do you find new partners? I wouldn't imagined 5 years ago that we'd be in a reparations conversation, and what Alan has brought us into, I see his partner Arya on this webinar as well, but being able to stretch through your partners. We at PolicyLink are forever changed by having Alan as part of us. And so when we think about that, that helps us think about how to make these decisions, how dollars should be flowing, who Erica might partner with next as a fiscal sponsee. So now that we're actually building an ecosystem of change. So first is relationships, second is community, and the third is openness. You got to be open. You got to be open to new partners that are going to really stretch you. You know, we could continue to move with the folks that we've known for 20 years, but the racial equity movement now, the way we win is actually how do we do this work across sectors? How do we do it in civil society? How do we actually transform government to be anti-racist and then get corporations to be working with us? So then we think about in this open-minded framework, how do you build on those relationships? You center community and then really begin to stretch. And when that starts to happen, that has been the magic for PolicyLink, really building on legacy, being able to always center people of color and community, and at the same time, find relationships that you never could imagine having. I'll pause there and just see if Alan, I sort of implicated you a bit in this, but I really appreciate it because that relationship is pushing us, and it's also pushing us into new areas to be able to raise money collectively. Alan?
Yeah, I mean, this piece is just really, really important. We can't underscore it enough. Just to be even more tangible in terms of our processes, and me even referencing other processes on my journey in the past 15 years working in the philanthropic space, like on the road of getting out these grants, and I haven't said who they were because it's not public yet, but we will announce them soon. I really have to credit the work of really Arya and our other co-founder Garrett when I first came on board to Liberation Ventures, and all of the one-on-ones that they were doing in the space to try to learn the space. And on that journey, in me picking up the work of supporting the movement partnerships in the mobilization and building work, it was as simple as me asking other partners who I was building with relationships with, who else do you know in this work who you've partnered with? And we had a list, and I did a short list. Do you know any of these organizations? What's your relationship with them? If they're not on this list, tell me who they are so that I can talk to them, and I can also connect you to other organizations who you don't know. And I know that relational work takes time. It's a slowing down time. And I think a lot of times when people are doing landscape analysis, people are trying to rush, right? So they can get the quick fix around oh, we got the money out the door and we got the big PR announcement. We done launched our $36.4 million investment or whatever it is. But I think what's really important behind those numbers, again, are the relationships. So having a network strategy around who knows who and how you're being with people and talking about values and talking about where you come from and who you grew up with, all of those things are organizing one-on-one things that I've brought into my working in philanthropy for the past 15 years. And it's the reasons why I can see programs like Forward Promise out of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation become a national program, because the people who were doing that work really valued what it meant to do a call for ideas and a call for collaboration before actually even doing RFP. So it's an amount of letting go of control to say, you know what, we're going to go on Twitter, we're going to crowdsource the ideas from people before we even go out and put out an RFP for something. a request for proposals and really do some sense making into what does the field believe about young men and boys of color and the programs that people are implementing across the United States before we get ready to launch, our grant making initiative. It also means from that grantor-grantee relationship and the intermediary relationship that we have to encourage our grantees about the power that they have to make decisions about where resources go to meet their political ends and needs. And so I know on the road of also building out this field building organization for liberation ventures, it also meant ARIA cultivating relationships with folks like Joan Gibbs over at Threshold, and they just launched their Black Flow Fund that we're a part of, and it means a part of the grant that they gave us goes towards our overall operations, and the other part of it we're distributing to other groups who we know. That's another network strategy that they've employed and put in place, and so we've included those organizations who we've re-granted to as part of their Flow Fund, and so it allows for us to do some resource mobilization in that role with other institutional funders and donor networks. And I'll just say lastly, and I would be remiss without saying this, that on the building of this field building effort, we've had also our program consultant, Jenny Goldfarb, who has been instrumental with working with me and also Erica, and borrowing our lessons learned as I was a faculty member at Justice Funders, and she was one of the participants in bringing forward some of these streamlined processes around what it means for our potential grantee partners to then receive the grant, the no reporting requirements, to be able to have these creative ideas and hear them from both Mike and Eric around the podcasting, because these are things that I even had thought of in my head to do when I was a funder some time ago, that I'm not even going to mention the year that I was a funder. But having all of those creative and innovative ways that really center what are the grantees' needs, what's the partners' needs, and making sure that they're in a learning and improvement stance, and that they are able to set the standards of expectation around that versus the person who has the money in the grantor role. So I want to shout out Katali Foundation, Chorus Foundation, because we learned a lot from them in this process, getting to our first round of re-granting in partnership with PolicyLink. But then also I know this week, Solidaire Katali and Justice Funders has a Twitter town hall at 1 p.m. really on this talk about power within the grant making space and what it means to utilize the relationships, the power, and the money to be able to build self-determining communities in places. So I can share that information as well. Folks, outside of this conversation are looking for more resources, but wanted to share that too, along with PolicyLink's work really on whiteness as they continue their work around equity.
And Alan, could you speak just really quickly about the choir book with Justice Funders? Because I think that's a great place for a lot of these folks to start.
Yes, I can do a quick blip on that. So the choir book was Justice Funders' initial framework on how to transform the grant making process within institutional philanthropic organizations so that really the power is transferred more on the grantee's end. And with that, it really goes through a cycle of the grant making process from what it means to build strategy, grant making strategy that centers the grantees in a just transition, all the way down to really the monitoring and evaluation and shifting into a learning and innovative organization that is taking the learnings from the program and the operations for the organization sustainability and the overall ecosystem sustainability. So that's the choir book. So it goes through these steps, and through the choir book, Justice Funders has a leadership program for grant makers called the Harmony Initiative, which I was a faculty member and director of for a year while I was there.
Thank you. And I see that link just appeared in the chat. So I appreciate y'all sharing the opportunity. And I guess what I'm hearing in this third of the conversation is that obviously re-granting is one of many strategies and paradigm shifts we're seeing in an effort to really center grantees and organizations led by people of color to advance this work in service of equity. So I like the idea of contextualizing this piece, which is both tactical and strategic, and like a broader conversation about where we think the sector can really go. So I want to open up for Q&A before we do a last round of closing reflections. And folks can feel free to either raise their hands on the Zoom using that function. Hopefully we're all well practiced this into Zoom world, or jump in the chat with any questions you have. So I see one question already popped up from Mary at Up Together. It's a question on regranting directly to people and families, AKA direct cash transfers, as opposed to through organizations, and any experience or perspective you all have on thinking about individuals or families as the sort of unit of beneficiary.
Through our COVID-19 response, we did some direct cash assistance transfers. We probably in Central Harlem distributed over $3 million directly to families in need for various instances. There was support needed around the holidays. There was food insecurity. There were emergency funds that were needed that folks had with funeral costs or some other necessities that they needed to provide. So I think we struck the right balance, and we actually were transparent with our funders about having part of our money, sorry, my Boston accent came out in that, Cecilia, you can hold me down on that. Part, I'm gonna pronounce my R's, of that, of the funds that we raised would go towards direct cash assistance and transfers, because in many ways it was helping to shape the narrative that people in need are going to make good decisions with the resources. I think oftentimes there is a mental model of those that are impacted by poverty not making the right decisions for themselves or their families. So it was a very intentional way of speaking to that mental model, helping to break that, and being able to provide the resources directly to those in need.
The only small thing to add here, Hailing, and then maybe take other questions, is Kwame, that is right on, especially for direct service organizations. And I think that we're seeing ourselves in this ecosystem approach, right? How do we not shy away from direct cash transfers when needed and necessary? And I think it's always at this point, there's 100 million people living at or near poverty that are suffering every day. And so we take these situations as a pandemic to shine a light on reality for a lot of folks. And that's 1 out of 3 Americans. And so thinking about that on one end of the spectrum, and then also how do we hold those investments in a systems change framework? And I think that's what you're hearing from Alan, the work of PolicyLink, Harlem Children's Zone, and really the Institute itself. Hailing, this is your work. How do we hold that full continuum and not say one or the other, but the answer should always be both? And really being able to say, yes, we need to do this. We need to alleviate human suffering now, yesterday, and a tenfold. And at the same time, we need to change the structures that keep repeating this type of oppressive behavior on so many people living in this country.
Talk about a choir book. You are singing my song, so I appreciate that. Ali, I see your hand raised. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a really helpful conversation. One thing I wanted to hear you guys talk about a little bit is just how you layer place and like neighborhood-based work on top of this model. Is it, maybe it's not on top of, maybe it's just parallel, but adding that, different neighborhoods within the same place, like Oakland being a place, need different interventions and have different leaders.
Sorry, I want to make sure, Ali, I'm understanding your question. Can you say 1 or 2 more sentences about the place impact of regranting?
Yeah, to me, this gets to the politics question. The politics issue you guys talked about a lot was when an organization is looking to sort of bring funding into a community, and different neighborhoods need different types of interventions. How do you navigate the politics and of regranting in certain areas and not regranting in other areas?
Okay. That's a fantastic question. One of the things that we had to face, right? We picked 7 cities that obviously have various neighborhoods, Oakland being one of them. It is about understanding from the beginning that no good deed goes unpunished.
Got it.
Right? So, and I don't say that facetiously. If you're in the business of regranting and you think you're going to make friends, you're in the wrong business. There's always going to be someone who is upset about not receiving funds, not receiving enough funds to do, right? Like that's just the reality of what we're operating in, which brings me back to making sure that you are anchored in a North Star and what you are able, what you are trying to accomplish and what can you deliver on with excellence at scale. Because at the end of the day, if you water down the impact that you have in trying to appease the feelings of folks within a certain geographic area, neighborhood, or what have you, ultimately you undermine your ability to be effective. And if you're not effective, then you're not going to get any more resources, right? And I have this term that I use called long-term grief, right? And that being very strategic in what you're trying to accomplish, who is best set up to be able to execute on that vision, so that can unlock additional resources that you, so therefore you can bring others into the fold, and having a transparent conversation about that. As long as you are anchored in your truth authentically, so it's not just like, oh, Kwame's just giving money to his best friend, right? It is rooted on that common North Star. There's a direct level of transparency on why certain resources are going where and what that could unlock down the line. I think was the most helpful tool, because it was something that we had to face in the selection of our partners within our regranting effort.
Great, thanks, Kwame. Jeff, I saw your hand up. I think you may have retracted it, but we got time for one more question if you want to jump in.
Sure, thank you. I wasn't trying to keep us after the hour, but I wonder, I mean, everybody on this call is concerned about not making the kind of errors that would actually take something that you're trying to do good and actually end up with a bad result. I wonder if there's one thing you would say, hey, you should just be aware of this. What would that be? What sort of, I think, closing message would you give us to allow us to do a better job of regranting?
Great. So let's go across. Maybe Josh, you can start.
I was going to see if I can end, but I'm going to start probably at a bigger place you want, but the folks that are in it every day, Jeff, there's something that comes to mind. Regranting is not about regranting. Regranting is actually seeing the change that we all want to see in the world. And that is the biggest lesson, is actually bring a results framework to this work, set a population, and drive the regranting process to that results framework. And if you remember one thing that PolicyLink has learned, is that results framework has saved us so many times, and actually being able to have political conversations, being able to have money conversations, and get out of being in the way of, as Kwame would say, money doing its job, because our job is to create a better world. I'll turn to others here about things to do on the technical side, but that is essential for us. And thank you.
All right, any quick 30-second wrap-ups to follow that mic drop?
It's a tough mic drop to follow. I think one of the things that I've learned as a leader is the ability to manage paradox, and multiple things can be true at the same time. So while being in a position of power as a regrantor, you still need to be able to create a sense of true partnership and equity. But at the end of the day, there's a certain level of responsibility that falls on you as the regrantor. And it goes back to the term, Hayden, that you said about centralized accountability. And I think one of the mistakes that I often see is that when times are good, there's a sense of centralized accountability around the win. But if difficult times happen, everybody likes to finger point. And so if you are in the position to be grantor, there's a level of centralized accountability that you are signing up for, even if you're not in the business of the direct service of whoever you re-granted to is. So you have to be really clear about the roles that each other plays, and the centralized accountability role, i.e. having skin in the game in order to engender a deep sense of trust. Otherwise, you're at risk of having the relationship fall apart.
Thank you. Erica, Alan, anything you'd add before we close?
Those two are hard pieces to follow up. I think they covered everything.
Thank you, Erica. Alan, you good, man?
Yeah. I don't have much here either, other than I feel like in the practice of what it means to develop and build relationships in order to do regranting in such a way that builds power, you have to embody it. So meaning when we're talking about trust as a value, it means you have to practice it. And if it didn't take the 8 months of iterating, experimenting, doing polling, having one-on-ones, talking about the state and local work around reparations and building those relationships and trust through these little experiments that we were doing, I don't think we would have gotten as far as to be able to put out this first round of grants. It would have not happened, just to be honest. And I think learning by doing is the best way to be able to instill the values of what you want to be animated in your grant making process. And that grant making is a larger part of resource mobilization and field building. It's not it by itself. If we're in the business, as Josh mentioned, around making change happen in communities. And so it has to happen alongside those things. So I'll say that as my closing remark, especially as we do this work around reparations and practicing what it means to be a part of repairing a lot of what has happened in this country that creates a culture that continues to replicate the status quo that we're currently in, hence why we're having this conversation. So
Thank you.
that's it on mine.
Appreciate it, Alan. Well, this has been a really rewarding conversation. We could have spent all afternoon on this. Thank you all for spending a few minutes past the hour with us. And if the comments are any indication, this has been really valuable for our folks around the country. So thank you all, Josh, Erica, Alan, Kwame, for spending the time with us. For our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be happy to distribute the recording. I know some folks need to jump or may want to share with their teams. If you have any other questions about this, feel free to reach out to the Institute. We're obviously here to support however we can be helpful. And we're really looking forward to continuing these conversations with you all. Hopefully this will be the first of many more to come on these critical conversations that we're working through together. Thank you all and take good care.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.